Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful offering by nailib.com. We are dealing with paper 2 as a part of our history SL syllabus, or the entire IB history syllabus, because both SL and HL will be doing this paper 2. And in that we are dealing with authoritarian states. We've just started our exploration and we are talking about some of the key details in terms of terminology and in terms of the tools that one can use to analyze all of these authoritarian states as a part of our essay writing exercise that shall be done in this particular paper. So in here, the key question then that arises as a part of all the things that we discussed in the last video. The key question that arises is, of course, the question of the problems in analysis that come for students who try to analyze these authoritarian regimes, etc. together. Of course, when I say students, I mean research scholars as well, or historians as well. We all try to attempt to analyze them, and we do face this problem as well. So it's better that you are aware of this problem at your own age and you're able to deal with this problem when you think of your essay answer. So let's quickly jump into the problems in analysis and how they affect our understanding of these authoritarian regimes. So in analyzing authoritarian regimes and single party systems, what has to be allowed for is the wide difference between cultures. This is particularly important where concepts are concerned. Some words do not easily translate, and political concepts sometimes shift their meaning or emphasis. An obvious example is the word democracy. In a Western liberal sense, the word relates to the rights of the individual, of the people, by the people, for the people. Whereas in a Soviet or Chinese context, it refers to the rights of the group. So it's not so much the individual but the group. That was why Mao and Stalin could use the word democracy unblushingly to describe the unchallengeable control of their single party system. So for them, their single party system, which was representative of the group's power, was very much democracy, just like in the Western liberal sense, the individual rights are counted as democracy. In Western terms, a single party democracy is a contradiction in terms, whereas for Julius Nyerere, the Tanzanian leader, the single party system was the best means of achieving a democracy. So this is the kind of contradiction that arises when you try and look at a term and only describe it or understand it in one context without the cultural context. Similarly, there's also the issue of preconceptions. A major problem for liberal historians, particularly those in the West, is that they tend to see democracy as the basic form of responsible representative government. The overarching necessity of democracy, requirement of civilizational, any kind of responsible representative governance process. Any system that does not accord with that notion is regarded as falling short of an ideal. So think about all the other systems that we have seen in the 20th century in terms of Afghanistan, in terms of Iraq, because they don't seem to be reaching this very high ideal of the individual's rights and being regarded as independent rights. Then they see themselves, they see these particular forms of government as failing an ideal. However, thinkers and leaders from other cultures dismiss this as an example of Western presumption. Western values are not definitive and should not therefore be regarded as prescriptive. As Nyerere was concerned to point out, democracy was not an end but a means, and there was no absolute value attaching to it. So there's no way that one can attach absolute value to things which are only being interpreted from a Western perspective. So there should be no absolute value attached to democracy. Context and practical considerations, not an abstract notion, should determine what an ideal system in a particular region is like. Nyerere indeed claimed that the two-party system as it operated in Britain and other Western countries was a barrier to, not a guarantee of, genuinely representative government, and in that he is perhaps absolutely right. Despite being a negative authoritarian leader, he is very much right in enjoying this kind of a new regional definition of the government that should be there. So responsible government can be interpreted in multiple forms. Democracy need not be the final way in which regional governments and regional ideas are interpreted. Although all the systems in this book claim to be revolutionary, not all were so in practice or in effect. Later explorations will show that a number of them looked back as much as forward. For example, Nazism was essentially an appeal to the past in an attempt to restore the traditional Volkisch values and virtues of German history. So the folkish values, the values of the people, was something that the Nazis were very, very interested in bringing back from the past, from a glorified past. Similarly, the Tanzanian leader declared that the socialism he was adopting as the way forward for the new Tanzanian nation was drawn directly from the collective values of Africa's tribal past. So that is also something that people are talking about and developing on as far as the continental past or the regional past is concerned. Castro's personalized form of communism was an expression of his desire to rid Cuba of its colonial inheritance and return his people to a pre colonial form of national purity. So, again, the fact that there were colonial powers that were ruining his country, he wanted to go back to a pre colonial past. So, again, the desire for coming back to history. Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt, worked under the banner of socialism, but his primary aim was to assert the independence of Egypt and lead his nation in a resurgent Arab and African world. So that is something that Nasser wanted for his own country, Egypt. And finally, Peron, who is from Argentina, took a similar line in Argentina. His wish was to see his country modernized by basing its growth on traditional virtues and skills of the Argentinian people. So, individual regional effort or regional like politics would be given, or background would be given much more superiority and would be given much more significance and priority over other kind of historical examples that are available from this idea of the West. And this is something that's also true for Western nations such as Germany. So, how does this the development of authoritarianism and totalitarianism take place? What factors explain this development of totalitarianism and authoritarianism? So, we will look at some of the historical context in which these regimes develop as a part of the 20th century history. The first essential causation factor that has been very often not identified by historians is the First World War. So, the impact of the First World War, historians suggest that it was no accident that the 20th century saw a spate of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. This phenomenon was in large part a reaction to the destructive impact of the First World War that ended in 1918. Prior to the war, liberalism, a political movement which contained a central belief in human progress, had made considerable strides in Europe. There was a common conviction that the improvement in social conditions and the spread of education which had followed the recognition by European governments of the need to tackle physical and intellectual deprivation heralded a time of improvement for the world's people. So that is what the promise of liberalism is, that we shall all improve in education and we shall all improve in social condition, and therefore there shall be a better time that has come for all of us. However, the 1914 to 18 conflict shattered such dreams. In the face of the appalling devastation of war, liberals found it difficult to sustain that their concept of ordered progress had brought any good. This was a major challenge. The fact that the war caused so much of devastation, it created a lot of people who challenged the idea that, well, we did do education, we did try to improve social conditions, then how did the war happen? So that was something that the liberals found very difficult to reply to, and that is something that gives rise to other ideologies which are a direct challenge to this ideal of liberalism. For some persuasive radical thinkers, it was a short step from this to a conviction that discipline and control from above were more likely to create order and that national well-being than was a cumbersome democracy. So national well-being is something that people should be thinking of, rather than a democracy is something that some radical leaders started pushing for. Adding weight to this view was the plentiful evidence of the benefits of state authority. Like authoritarian states seemed to be doing better than the liberal states of the past. Every nation in the First World War had undergone a large and rapid expansion of centralized control over politics, society, and economy. It was arguable that without this centralization, no European nation would have survived. So, had that not happened, perhaps in the so-called democratic conditions, most European nations may not have survived at all. The lessons for national regeneration post-war were obvious. In time of crisis, democratic procedures were too inefficient to meet the needs of the state. That was the major lesson that most of these so-called nation states got out of the First World War, that if you want efficiency, democracy is not the right way to go, and efficiency is something that they really required after the devastation of the First World War. Significant groups who were to become influential concluded that social and political ideals were impossible to achieve simply by moderate evolutionary means. So, if you just go step by step, if you just go by moderate evolutionary means, then you just cannot get any kind of proper achievement of influential ideas. Progress did not occur spontaneously, that was the argument. It had to be imposed, and strong governments had to be prepared to make the sweeping, even violent changes that were needed in the name of progress. Whenever somebody would point out to Stalin, the kind of, the leader that we'll be looking at first as a part of our exploration, whenever someone pointed out to Stalin the kind of destruction and havoc that was caused in the name of socialism and in the name of communism in USSR, the simple example that he used to give, the analogy that he used to draw, was with the making of an omelette. He would say that in order to make an omelette, you have to break the egg. And that's the same logic that is being required here also, and is being told about here also, that progress does not occur simultaneously. It has to be imposed, and even if violence is required in the name of that progress, then that also is absolutely justified. The question, of course, is what was the omelette? Like that. What was the progress? Did the progress come? The cost, did it justify the kind of quote unquote progress that did take place? Such views were particularly strong held among certain sections in relatively new states of Germany and Italy, where democratic traditions were weak or even non existent. Scorning that what they regarded as the ineffectual methods of democracy, certain groups of nationalists in these countries developed an extreme form of anti democratic politics, believing that only by such means could their nation achieve its destiny or greatness. Nowhere this was more evident than in Germany, where a significant number of the population had a searing sense, a very painful sense of bitterness at their defeat in the First World War in 1918. It was such bitterness that National Socialists or Nazis relied upon, directing their attack at the German government, which they asserted had in fact cravenly admitted a humiliating, defeating peace and a dictated peace. The triumph of democracy, then. So, what sometimes confuses the analysis is that the First World War was still regarded by some as the triumph of democracy, in that the Allies claimed that they represented democracy. So, America claimed, and Britain claimed, and France claimed that we represent democracy, therefore, our victory is equal to the victory of democracy. But that was a much later development. At the start of the war in 1914, democracy had not been one of Allies' declared aims. Their only certain objective was to defeat Central Powers. Moreover, the idea that one of the Allies, Tsarist Russia, as a champion of democracy defied common sense, because obviously Russian history is a history of autocratic past and not at all of democracy. It is true that as the war dragged on, Britain and France claimed to be fighting for civilized values against Germany's decadence, but what eventually gave the Allies their democratic image was the entry of the USA into the war in 1917. So USA had been a democracy since its birth in 1776, and therefore by the entry of USA, the whole movement became a conversation about the spread of democracy versus the kind of role that the Central Powers were playing. And with the express purpose, as stated by the president of the US, Woodrow Wilson, to make the world safe for democracy. So that is how USA enters the war, with the reason that we are making the world safer for a democracy, and therefore US participation is necessary. Now, how much of it is propaganda, how much of it is reality, only time tells us later on. It was this that enabled the Allies to claim retrospectively that had been their purpose all along. Like when declaring the purpose, democracy was not a part of the picture, but retrospectively, they were happy to say that look, from the day one, from the very first day, our purpose was improvement of democracy. Now, self determination, the peace settlement that followed the military collapse of the Central Powers, was supposedly based on the principle of self determination. Yet powerful though self determination was as an idea, it did not always implied democracy, since it was applied in very selective ways. So, self determination is basically people who identify as one group, they rule themselves. Self determination, we shall determine who are our people and we shall rule them together. Although it was meant to recognize legitimate national aspirations, the principle was in fact not extended to the defeated nations at all. So the idea was that everybody will get a chance to be self determined, but the defeated nations were never asked for any kind of opportunity, or were never given an opportunity for self determination. Indeed, it was just used as a justification for dismembering the German, Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires and creating new states out of the remnants, a process that left Germany and other parts of Europe with a deep sense of grievance. So why do you use self-determination? You use it to tear apart empires which were your enemies and then give them individual freedom. So the British Empire was not torn apart, the French Empire was not torn apart, but the German territories on the European continent were torn apart. Similarly, the Austro-Hungarian territories on the European continent were torn apart, and so is also true for the Ottoman Empire in Asia. So all of that is being done just towards the enemy, the defeated countries, the victorious powers. They don't give up their empire, and of course there's no talk at all about self-determination amongst the colonies of UK and France. Self-determination was also regarded with grave suspicion by imperial powers that had survived the war, such as Britain and France. They saw the principle as a threat to their continued hold over colonies, because at some point of time the colonies would find out this gap and would also start questioning it. So the impact of the economic crisis. Anti-democratic arguments might have had less influence had there been a general recovery from the economic effects of the First World War. But apart from occasional short-lived economic boons in the 1920s, the post-war trend was unremittingly grim. That means it was really bad, the situation after the First World War. And they reached their nadir. Nadir is the lowest point possible. It's the opposite of the word zenith. Zenith is the highest possible point of something. Nadir is the lowest possible point of something. So reaching its nadir in the Great Depression of 1930s. It started in 1929, but of course the main after effects are seen in the 1930s. In the atmosphere of despair and recrimination that the economic hardships created, fragile democratic structures started to collapse. Nor should it be thought that the dictatorships of the period were always imposed on an unwilling people. The success of the Italian fascism starting in the 1920s and the German Nazism in the 1930s is taking over the state was related to genuine popularity of their regime. So it's not something that the authoritarian states are always opposed by the democratic people. Many a times you see their success in the kind of popularity that they gain because they have proved the ineffectual nature, the ineffective nature of the democracies against which they were competing. The conversion of the middle classes and the traditional supporters of constitutionalism to support the extreme right was a clear sign that those seeking order and security no longer believed that it could be guaranteed by the progress of democracy or by the process of democracy either. So, democracy had clearly lost this kind of a clear battle, the pitched battle, and these right wing authoritarian states were clearly winning it. So then we come to the idea of the interwar democracy, that dictatorships, pardon me, that we see at this point of time. So in this context, we have a number of important dictatorships. Let's see them. Between 1919 and 1939, when the Second World War began in Europe, many states came under the control of regimes which abandoned any pretensions of liberal democracy. So they didn't even want to be seen as liberal democracy. In fact, democracy became a word of abuse in their political lexicon. One of them, Russia, the Soviet Union after 1922, Italy, Turkey, Germany, Spain, and Portugal, as well as many other Central and Eastern European states, adopted dictatorships or became increasingly authoritarian and placed crippling restriction on democratic institutions. So, just because a country did not declare itself to be authoritarian, what did not necessarily mean that they were a democratic country, because even there could be crippling restrictions on democratic institutions, especially like control of the opponents and control of the media, etc. In Russia, the Bolshevik Communist Party led by Vladimir Lenin had seized power in 1917 and imposed what it called the dictatorship of the working class or the proletariat. In Italy, Benito Mussolini led his fascist party to victory in 1922 and ruled as a dictator until being overthrown in April of 1943. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, although intent on avoiding the extremes of fascism and communism, attempted to turn his country into a modern secular state and resorted to increasingly dictatorial methods of control to do so. This is one of the rarer examples where a leader claims that that he is making his country secular and then starts burning and destroying it. So, because usually this happens in the name of religion in most other contexts, but Ataturk is a very unique example where the secular state was brought about by dictatorial tendencies. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party came to power in 1933. In Spain, General Francisco Franco, having led his ultra-nationalist Falangist party to victory in civil war that ended in 1939, ruled as a right-wing dictator until his death in 1975. So he outlives all his other compatriots such as Hitler, Mussolini, even Stalin, and he's alive till 1975. In Portugal, Antonio Salazar, as Prime Minister and then President, led his new state party in a right-wing dictatorship from 1932 to 1974. So some of these interwar dictatorships are in fact having an impact up till the 1970s as well. Even where democracy appeared to operate, for example, in some Western European nations, it was arguable that their appearance belied the reality. That indeed was the charge that Lenin made. He defined liberal democracy as a charade used by the propertied classes who hold power in countries such as Britain and France to justify and perpetuate their rule over the people. He dismissed the supposedly free elections that were happening in these countries as shams which left the bourgeois power structure untouched. And of course, Lenin is not original in saying all of this. This is all coming from Marxist analysis of class struggle leading directly to historical problems. Outside Europe during the same period, it was a very similar story of growing authoritarianism. The tendency towards dictatorship was clearly evident in Central and Southern America, whose constitutional traditions were even weaker than those of Europe. So, of course, we gave the example of Argentina and we gave the example of other countries in that area. In areas of Africa sufficiently free of colonial control to shape their own systems exhibited a similar trend. Tribal traditions and cultures were essentially authoritarian there as well. So that's the case of Tanzania. Imperialist Japan, that you can obviously cover with our own Neil IB case study of Japanese expansionism, developed along authoritarian lines matching those of fascist Europe. Emperor Hirohito came under the controlling influence of an aggressive war party intent on shaping Japan into a military power capable of colonizing Asia by force. In China, the Kuomintang government was democratic in theory but authoritarian in practice. Sun Yat-sen declared, on no account must we give more liberty to the individual. Let us secure liberty instead for the nation. Similarly, under his successor Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang government became markedly more authoritarian, something that Mao would continue as the communist successor of these nationalist governments. There were even critics in the USA who argued that Roosevelt's New Deal was undemocratic since the state directed method it's used smacked of either socialism or fascism. So these kind of charges are there across all democratic nations and across all countries which might claim to be democracies but were ruling in a very authoritarian manner. Again, trying to point out to you that the kind of separation, the kind of differentiation that we imagine in our minds about these states is not true at all. On reality, the ground reality is much more blurred and much more open to interpretation and analysis. Now, how does all of this impact how does all of this change by the impact of the Second World War between 1939 and 45? At the end of the Second World War, there was an understandable sympathy for the idea of the collective state. It had been through collective, even regimented effort that the Allies had emerged victorious. In response to the national crisis that the war brought, many countries resorted to authoritarian methods again. Indeed, even in the supposedly liberal democracies, some form of authoritarianism had been the norm for all the states that were involved in the Second World War. Britain had introduced restrictions such as internment and DORA. The USA had also interned those of its citizens, such as Japanese Americans, whom it regarded as a potential threat to the war effort. So, even announced liberal democracies like USA and UK are involving in so-called authoritarian measures because they are restricting their own citizens from challenging their action during the war. The great majority of the population accepted these restrictions as a price to be paid for national security and survival. So quite a few people in fact endorsed this, saying that no, it's not authoritarian at all, it's a part of democracy. Because we have to protect ourselves, we need to keep these effects into action. These are not totalitarian states since the measures were meant to be temporary and not permanent. Popular support is not required for a state to be authoritarian since central government can impose itself on the popular will, but it is possible for a state to be popular and authoritarian at the same time. The acceptance of authoritarianism extended in some instances into the acceptance of totalitarianism as well. So both authoritarian, which is the less degree version of this entire controlling attitude, versus the totalitarian version, which is the extreme form of authoritarian itself. So both were in fact acceptable in some circumstances or in some cases. It was evident that one of the allies, at least Stalin's USSR, did not conform to liberal democratic standards, but such was the desire of the other allies to win the war that this was completely ignored. And we have discussed this quite at length in one of our previous case studies as far as the prescribed subject for paper 1 is concerned, and we will continue to discuss this as a part of our paper 2 case study on Joseph Stalin as well. The prodigious effort made by Soviet people in defeating Germany was so impressive that many admirers in the Western countries concluded that without the totalitarian methods used by Stalin to direct the war effort, the USSR would have in fact been defeated. The Second World War also pronounced influence outside Europe in promoting centralized control. You have in North Korea, which was freed from Japan in 1945, adopting a particularly extreme form of communism under the leader Kim Il Sung. His grandson is the leader of North Korea. So it is something that started in 1945 and is continuing in North Korea even today. So that's the impact of the Second World War. Similarly, in China in 1949, Mao Zedong and his Chinese Communist Party defeated the nationalist Kuomintang opponents and began to create a Communist People's Republic of China under his leadership this time. And again, in terms of totalitarian instincts and authoritarian instincts, they inherit all the ideas of the nationalist Kuomintang government that came before them. Although the colonial powers in Southeast Asia, principally France, Britain, and Netherlands, had eventually won the war against Japan, the struggle had exposed their military weakness and encouraged the growth of strong nationalist movements which demanded independence. The movements were invariably authoritarian in outlook and method. So please understand that when they are fighting for so-called independence, even their movements are authoritarian in outlook and methods. A notable example was Indonesia, where Sukarno led his independence movement to power in 1949, and for the next 17 years governed the country according to the principle of guided democracy, which was a euphemism for dictatorial control which involved the destruction of all forms of opposition. And Sukarno is only one example in the post World War II era wherein you see a leader taking away all the powers and leading his country as if he is the only enlightened ruler. Egypt under Nasser would be a very similar example. Similarly, Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah is a very similar example. Perhaps the only exception that stands out to this rule of leaders inheriting after the Second World War an independent nation and not ruling it with dictatorial control is Jawaharlal Nehru from India. He in no way overtly at least and covertly either was a dictatorial leader of that kind, but almost all his allies, almost all his contemporaries ensure that their country turns into a dictatorial country even when they are using euphemism in the name of democracy such as guided democracy. So that is something that is very useful. So let's conclude this section very quickly then. The history of the 20th century suggests that the military, social and economic uncertainties of the period were judged at critical times to require an all-powerful state to combat them. So you needed the all-powerful state in order to fight all the social, military and economic problems. That was the logic that was given. Internal and external enemies could be overcome only through effective government and like secure, centralized, powerful central government was a necessity in order to overcome not only internal enemies like your opponents, but also created external foreign enemies who are all the time trying to take over your country. Dictatorship aided by modern technology flourished in such an atmosphere. So aided by modern technology meaning that you have these ideas of making sure that you can be surveyed, that there is a question of there is a question of surveying you, there's a question of carrying you, the big notion that the big brother is watching you, which is coming from George Orwell's text 1984. So all of that is ensuring that dictatorships in fact flourish in this period. The absence of weakness of the traditions of democracy, the damaging of the liberal ethic by the two world wars, and the mutual fears of the left and the right, the collapse of economic security, and the idea of the nation state, all these factors combine to prepare or consolidate the ground for authoritarian regimes in 20th century Europe and elsewhere in the world. Of the 7 or 8 authoritarian, we will be examining 8. Mussolini is not a part of this text. We'll be analyzing that from a different text. The first chronologically were the European states, so the Soviet Union and Germany. Although the regimes that developed elsewhere did not directly copy them, they did in a sense create models for development of modern dictatorship. So that is why we go first with Stalin and Hitler, because even though they were not copied necessarily, their models may have inspired other coming futuristic dictatorships. They certainly provide the observer with a valuable set of reference points that can be then used for other places as well. Of particular note is that two regimes theoretically represented the opposite ends of the left and right political system. So even though they were theoretically against each other, they do provide us with very useful ways and vantage points to exchange and look at each other. When the regime studied or referred to in this text are placed on the spectrum, the following pattern emerges, and that's a very useful way of looking at it. Please have a look at it. So Hitler's Germany is on the extreme right and Stalin's USSR is on the extreme left. So that's the pattern that emerges. And then you can see Castro's Cuba is moving towards center left, while Nasser's Egypt is left of the center. Similarly, Hirohito's Japan, Mussolini's Italy and Franco's Spain, they are all on the extreme right, whereas Salazar's Portugal and Perón's Argentina is still moving towards the right of the center. Ataturk's Turkey is immediately right of the center and Naire's Tanzania is just immediately left of the center, while Mao's China and Kim Il-sung's North Korea are extreme left, just like Stalin's USSR was. So it's useful to have a look at this map just in order to provide a clear visual imagery of which side you're looking for. And again, with all the kind of limitations that we spoke of the left and right system and the name and the tag, it's still quite useful to try and portray this and try and utilize this for our own references later on. The other thing that you can use this map for, and perhaps Neil IB is not going to cover all of these, in case you are interested in doing any other authoritarian states out of the 8 that we are going to do, there are other examples also available on this chart that you can pursue as a part of your own individual exploration. So Hirohito's Japan, for instance, or Salazar's Portugal, for instance, or Kim Il-sung's North Korea, for instance, can also be used by you as a part of your paper to study. So just it's an open field for us to choose from. We are going to do 8. You can do more if you want. As visual illustration, it suffers from the weakness of suggesting fixed placement. That the same problem that left and right are seen as fixed points. So as a visual illustration, this suffers from that limitation, but it does provide a useful set of references which can be debated as to their accuracy once you have studied your chosen regimes from the following exploration. So hopefully we'll all enjoy this, and we'll continue to criticize and question and challenge this left and right division, but at the same time use it also for our purposes when writing wonderful paper 2 answers that can make our journey to that sweet 7 really easy. And for that, we here at Yale IB remain committed. Hoping to see you in the next video, where we will start with Joseph Stalin and the exploration of his authoritarian regime, starting in Russia and turning into USSR in 1922, and we shall see how that takes place in the 20th century. Hoping to see you in that next video. Till then, thank you so much.